You probably think you're not improving, but what if you're measuring the only thing that changes last? Think about the last few months. Maybe you've been working on something, studying, building a project, going to the gym, learning a language, creating videos. You probably have one question in the back of your mind. Is this actually working? Most people answer that question by looking at the scoreboard. The number on the scale, the money in the bank, the views, the subscribers, the grades, the promotion, the finished product. If those numbers don't change, they assume nothing else has changed either. That feels logical. It also creates one of the biggest misunderstandings about progress, because the scoreboard is usually the last thing to change. Long before the result changes, something else changes first. You do, not in some dramatic way, not overnight, and usually not in a way that's easy to notice. The strange thing about improvement is that you experience it from the inside. That makes it almost invisible. Imagine talking to someone you haven't seen in 5 years. They notice your accent, your confidence, the way you explain things, the way you react to problems. You don't, because you've been living with those changes every single day. The same thing happens with almost every meaningful skill. At first, everything feels difficult. You have to think about every step. Every decision feels uncertain. Everything takes longer than you expected. Then, slowly, something changes. You stop checking every little detail. You make decisions faster. You recover from mistakes more quickly. You hesitate less. You solve problems that used to stop you for hours. The strange part is that you rarely stop to notice any of this. Because once something becomes normal, your brain immediately starts treating it as if it had always been there. That's why people often believe they haven't improved. Not because they haven't, because yesterday's achievement becomes today's baseline. This happens so slowly that you almost never notice it. The things that once demanded all of your attention become ordinary. The problem is that ordinary things don't feel like achievements anymore. They simply become your new normal. And once something becomes normal, your brain immediately starts looking for the next problem to solve. That's why progress often feels strangely empty. Not because it isn't happening, because every improvement quietly erases the memory of how difficult things used to be. Think about learning to drive. The first lesson feels overwhelming. Mirrors, pedals, traffic, signs. Everything demands your attention. A year later, you drive somewhere and don't remember half of the journey. Nothing magical happened that day. Thousands of tiny improvements simply became automatic. Now think about any project you've spent months working on. Maybe it still isn't where you want it to be. That's all your brain sees. It compares today's result with your ideal future. It almost never compares today's version of you with the person who started. That comparison is much harder. It doesn't fit neatly into a graph. There isn't a number for better judgment. There isn't a chart for faster decisions. There isn't a notification telling you that you've become more patient, or more resilient, or better at solving problems. Those improvements happen quietly, which makes them easy to ignore. This is why people become obsessed with outcomes. Outcomes are easy to measure. Skills are not. Results are public. Growth is private. Imagine if you judged a musician only by the number of concerts they've played, or a writer only by the number of books they've published. You would completely miss the thousands of quiet hours where the real improvement happened. That's exactly what many people do to themselves. They ignore the practice. They ignore the repetitions. They ignore the mistakes that slowly disappear. And then they wonder why they never feel like they're making progress. The scoreboard is addictive because it's simple. One number tells you whether you're winning or losing. Real progress is rarely that simple. Imagine someone learning a language. They keep asking, "Am I fluent yet?" Probably not. But maybe they stop translating every sentence in their head. Maybe conversations don't feel as exhausting. Maybe they understand jokes now. None of those things look impressive on paper. Yet they're exactly the reason fluency eventually arrives. Or think about someone building a business. Revenue hasn't changed much. But now they make decisions in 10 minutes that used to take 3 days. They notice bad ideas earlier. They communicate more clearly. They recover from setbacks faster. Those changes won't appear on a monthly report. They're still progress. In many ways, they're the most important kind, because those invisible improvements eventually create visible results, not the other way around. People often think success changes you. Sometimes that's true, but much more often, you change first. Success simply makes those changes visible. That's why comparing yourself to other people can become so misleading. You're comparing their visible outcomes with your invisible growth. You're looking at someone else's scoreboard while completely ignoring your own development. It's an unfair comparison, not because they don't deserve their success, but because you're comparing different parts of the process. One of the biggest mistakes people make is asking, where are the results? A better question might be, what has become easier that used to feel difficult? That question reveals a completely different picture. Maybe starting doesn't feel as scary. Maybe criticism doesn't stop you anymore. Maybe you finish things more often. Maybe you spend less time overthinking. Maybe you recover faster after a bad day. None of those changes go viral. None of them get celebrated. But they quietly change the person producing the work. And once the person changes, the results usually follow, just not immediately. This is why so many people quit too early. Not because they aren't improving, because they can't measure the kind of progress that actually matters. They're watching the scoreboard. The real progress is happening in the player. Think about the person you were a year ago. What used to stop you immediately? What used to feel impossible? What made you panic? What made you quit? Chances are, some of those things don't even feel difficult anymore. Not because life became easier, because you've quietly become more capable. The strange thing is that capability rarely announces itself. It simply becomes the new version of normal. Eventually, the scoreboard catches up, but by then, the most important work has already happened. You became someone who thinks differently, works differently, learns differently, recovers differently. The outside world simply took longer to notice. That's why I think one of the most useful questions you can ask yourself isn't, am I getting the results I wanted? It's this: am I becoming the kind of person who eventually gets those results? Because if the answer is yes, then your progress isn't missing. It's simply happening somewhere you forgot to look.